I've created this short presentation to answer some of the most pressing questions concerning the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, especially the recent news that the Patriarch of Constantinople plans to bestow a tomos of autocephaly upon the Church in Ukraine. Let's begin with canonical territory. Essentially, this is a disagreement between two churches, both of whom claim to be the mother church of the church in Ukraine, notably and specifically the Kievan Metropolia. Constantinople's position is as follows. In the year 1686, Constantinople ceded something to the Moscow Patriarchate. Constantinople claims that this was not a transfer of jurisdiction, that the only change that was made was that they asked and granted the Patriarch of Moscow the right to ordain the Kievan Metropolitan for the purpose of convenience. According to Constantinople, they remained the mother church throughout this time. There was no actual transfer of jurisdiction, and the Metropolitan of Kiev was supposed to commemorate at the liturgy the Patriarch of Constantinople in the diptychs and not the Patriarch of Moscow, which would indicate that Constantinople remained the mother church. In terms of how it relates to the tomos of autocephaly, essentially Constantinople is making the claim based on documents that they've published recently online that they are the mother church of the Kievan Metropolia, that Ukraine is their canonical territory, and that this gives them the right to correct canonical irregularities. Now, most people probably know that in the last many years in global Orthodoxy, the Ukrainian Church of the Kievan Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church were considered to be uncanonical. And Constantinople at the Synaxis that occurred earlier in September, one of the lectures that was delivered made the claim that the current statute of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is also uncanonical. The church is not an exarchate, it is not autocephalous, and it is not autonomous. It has the designation of enjoying broad autonomy with the privilege of self-governance, meaning that this church also is uncanonical. All of these factors form the basis for Constantinople's argument that they have the right and the prerogative to bestow a tomos of autocephaly. Moscow argues that in the year 1654, Kyiv broke away from the Polish kingdom and signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with Russia. This would be the Hetmanate, which had revolted against the Polish crown in 1648. So that when Constantinople handed over Kyiv to Ukraine, that this was indeed a transfer of jurisdiction and constituted the complete reunion of Kyiv with Moscow, which feeds into the notion that Kievan Rus and its principalities and city-states, even though they were in different places, all constituted one united people. And Moscow has put forward as their proof the title given to the Patriarch of Moscow as the Patriarch of Great and Russia. So that's the nutshell of canonical territory and the two opposing arguments that have been made. Now let us turn to the person of Patriarch Filaret, who served as the exarch of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine for many years. And in the year 1990, he was the head of the church in Ukraine when they changed the canonical status from exarchate to broad autonomy with the privilege of self-governance. Then in 1992, Filaret joined the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, was split into two. And the question about Filaret is what to do with his church since the Moscow Patriarchate deposed him in 1992 and then anathematized him in 1997. There is a lot of information circulating online and available to people to read about Filaret. that makes all kinds of accusations against him, from being extremely forceful to being corrupt to secretly having a family. He was never charged with any of these things. He was actually canonically charged with leading the church into schism, which is the reason he was deposed in 1992 and anathematized in 1997 by the Moscow Patriarchate. That is their side of the story. Filaret's side of the story is that when he appeared before the Synod of Bishops and the Patriarch in Moscow in the spring of 1992 and promised to retire, that he was coerced into making this promise, and as soon as he arrived in Kyiv, he announced that he had no intention to retire and was going to resume his work as the Metropolitan of Kyiv and continue on the path to canonical autocephaly. Now, what happened was, after that, in May 1992, the episcopate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow gathered in Kharkiv and elected Metropolitan Volodymyr Sabodan as their new primate. Filaret says that this is an uncanonical robber council, the Council of Kharkiv, because they convoked the council without him, and that this was a violation of the canons. Now, it's also important to note that Filaret himself, he joined the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church in 1992 in June at the Unification Council that was held. He did not establish that church, nor did he begin autocephaly. The impetus for autocephaly began in Ukraine in 1918, and the first church that was autocephalous emerged in 1921. In fact, Filaret was deputy patriarch, first to Mstislav and then to Volodymyr of the Kievan Patriarchate, up until Volodymyr's death in 1995 and Filaret's election at that time. I provide this information to clarify some of the issues out there, since most of the information that circulates on the internet attributes autocephaly as a project thought up by and inaugurated by Filaret in 1992, and that simply is not the case. Now, it's important to note that Filaret claims that he appealed his deposition to the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1992, and that he has formally appealed his deposition and anathematization 5 times to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and also to the other Eastern Patriarchs. So the question is, will there be canonical due process where a third neutral party will hear this case and finally decide it? Obviously, a great deal of time has elapsed since these charges were made, but this is a very important issue because global orthodoxy has tended to view the church led by Patriarch Filaret as uncanonical and has not shared communion with them. And for those who employ Cyprianic sacramental ecclesiology, all of those people and clergy would have to be reordained and rebaptized if you follow the Cyprianic method. So obviously a resolution to this contested issue is absolutely necessary. And as I said, it will be heard by a third party. That is what we are hearing. Finally, there's the question of the relationship between church and state and the role of politics. Is the Ukrainian autocephaly an American initiative? Well, in 1919, we have the first attempt by a Ukrainian government, which was quite short-lived because there were several parties vying for control of Ukraine at the time, that decreed legally that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine would be autocephalous, and obviously this didn't come to pass because the Bolsheviks ended up taking control in Ukraine. But this is how far back it goes. Since 1991 up until this day, there have been a variety of politicians, presidents and other politicians who have favored one group or another. So for example, for those who are complaining that President Poroshenko seems to be favoring the Kievan Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church, it's important to note that the opposition bloc in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine openly supports the Moscow Patriarchate. So politicians have been involved and continue to be involved in the Ukrainian sphere, and it happens on all sides. Now, as for the United States government, there have been a number of things that have circulated on the internet showing pictures, for example, of Patriarch Filaret with the recently reposed John McCain, and representatives of the Kievan Patriarchate were recently in Washington. Certainly, the United States government has an interest in this, but clearly, historically speaking, the initiative for autocephaly has been alive to varying degrees since 1918. And the Americans were never the authors of this initiative. I'm sure that certain American politicians, though probably not all, would like to use Ukrainian autocephaly as leverage against Russian power. But to make the claim that this is an American project, that it's being funded by Americans, there's plenty of money flowing from a variety of directions. That claim is a conspiracy theory that has absolutely no substance, that this is an American project. And then finally, there's the question of, well, what should be done with this schism? And I have here the Latin words from the Gospel of John, ut unum sint, that they would be one. Well, this has been elusive for 97 years. I would like to recommend that the first thing to do before assigning blame, which is the easiest thing to do to play the scapegoating game, is to try to understand the schism. And the only way to do that is to get to know the people of the communities on all sides who are involved. One thing that's become very clear is the refrain that the schismatics must return to the canonical church won't work in this situation, because those who have been called schismatics up until this point, they claim that they are canonical and need to have their case heard by the canonical churches. What is absolutely clear is that this schism will not be healed through coercion or through stating that this set of demands have to be met. In fact, these methods have failed. The proof of this is that in 1946, when the Moscow Patriarchate orchestrated the pseudo-synod in Lviv that liquidated the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, and then celebrated that as the return of the Greek Catholics to Orthodoxy, as soon as that church became legal again in 1989, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church returned to Ukraine and is flourishing in its own right. Certainly not as the largest church, but as a very strong force in many places of Ukraine, especially in West Ukraine. So attempting to heal the schism through coercion or absolute compliance to conditions has not worked, and it's not going to work. The people who are outside of the Moscow Patriarchate, they're not going to return no matter what. So the solution that has been put forward is to create an autocephalous church in Ukraine that will exist alongside some kind of body that still belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate. One might call it an eparchy or perhaps an exarchate, but the idea would be that the people, the parishes, the bishops who want to continue to belong to Moscow will have the right to do that. I do not think that this method is ideal. Ideally, there would have been an all-Ukrainian council that would have resolved this issue. But this method perhaps might be necessary at this point to finally bring those who have been outside of the church back into communion with global orthodoxy. The other methods have not worked, and they're not going to work. So the current solution, it's not ideal. It's probably, there may have been a better way, but given the conditions in Ukraine today, this is the method that would be used to reconcile the people into the church, with the hope that they would strengthen their communion in the next generation that follows.